Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Silent Passenger. Sarah was tired, bone tired, to the point where the weight of the day felt like an anchor, dragging her down with every step. The office had been brutal. Endless meetings, rushed projects, and the same tired faces staring back at her, as if they were all on some shared path to nowhere. The clock had finally hit 5, and it was time to leave. The world outside was dark, the kind of dark that feels too thick, like it could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. She pulled her coat tighter around her and headed to the bus stop. The cold bit at her skin, a sharp reminder that winter was not just coming, it was here. Her usual bus was late, as it often was. She waited, staring at the headlights in the distance, trying not to let the creeping unease set in. It was late, past 10, and she was always the last one left on the bus. The streets were empty, the silence around her punctuated only by the occasional screech of tires on wet asphalt. When the bus finally pulled up, its lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows on the street. As Sarah climbed aboard, she noted how quiet it was inside. The bus was nearly empty, with only one other passenger sitting at the front. He didn't turn as she made her way to the back, but she could feel his eyes on her. She sat down, trying to ignore the prickle of discomfort crawling up her spine. It wasn't that he was doing anything wrong. He was just sitting there, still, like he didn't belong in the world. His clothes were ragged, torn at the sleeves, and his shoes looked like they hadn't been replaced in years. But it wasn't the state of his clothing that bothered her. It was the way he stared. His eyes, pale, almost milky, seemed to burn with an intensity that felt wrong. Like he wasn't just looking at her, but through her, peeling back the layers of her skin, her thoughts, her secrets. She tried to focus on her phone, scrolling through her messages, pretending that she wasn't acutely aware of his presence. But she couldn't shake the feeling. It was like he was waiting for something, like this whole bus ride was some sort of tense countdown to an unknown event. The bus rumbled through the dark streets, the usual route that Sarah had taken for months, maybe years. The same tired, cracked sidewalks and darkened windows. The same passing landmarks that had become little more than background noise in her life. But tonight, everything felt off. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. The man's eyes were still locked on her, and this time, she felt a chill wash over her. The bus stopped, its brakes screeching, and Sarah gathered her things quickly, eager to get off. Her stop was coming up, and it couldn't come fast enough. She stood up, clutching her purse tightly, and moved toward the front. Just as she reached the door, she felt it, a cold, clammy hand gripping her wrist. Sarah froze. The man's hand was like ice, his fingers digging into her skin with unnatural strength. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. His pale eyes met hers, and for a moment, it felt like time stopped. His lips barely moved as he whispered, "You shouldn't have gotten off here." Her heart slammed against her chest, and panic surged through her like a tidal wave. She yanked her wrist free, stumbling backward, and without thinking, she bolted out of the door. The cold night air hit her like a slap in the face, and she ran, her feet pounding against the wet pavement. She didn't dare look back, didn't dare stop, but the sound of the bus's engine idling behind her was haunting. She could hear the hiss of the brakes, the low hum of the tires on the wet road. When she finally reached the corner of the street and dared to glance behind her, the bus was gone. No headlights, no sound of the engine, just the empty, dark stretch of road. She stood there, breathless, her heart still racing, and tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination. Maybe she had overreacted. Maybe it was the late hour getting to her. But something inside her told her it wasn't. The next morning, the events from the night before felt even more surreal. She went about her day, but her thoughts kept drifting back to that moment. That man, his eyes, his voice, it wouldn't leave her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had been terribly wrong. At lunch, she mentioned it casually to a colleague, Sarah's voice quieter than usual. "You ever have one of those weird encounters on the bus?" she asked. Her colleague, Linda, looked up, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "Well, last night, I was on the bus, and there was this guy." Sarah trailed off, unsure how to explain it. "He was just staring at me, not moving, not saying anything. And then he grabbed my wrist, and his hand was so cold. He said something like, 'You shouldn't have gotten off here.' I don't know, it just felt off." Linda's face changed. It wasn't fear, but something else, something more akin to recognition. "Sarah," Linda said softly, "you ever heard the story about the man on the bus?" Sarah frowned. "What are you talking about?" Linda hesitated, her eyes flicking to the other people in the office before she leaned in closer. "A year ago, a guy died in that area, near your stop. They never found his body, just disappeared. People say he still haunts that stretch of road. They say he shows up on the buses late at night, and if you're the last passenger." She trailed off, but Sarah didn't need her to finish. The room suddenly felt colder. The chill that had been gnawing at her all day wasn't just the air. It was something else. Sarah went home that night, but sleep didn't come easy. The man's voice, his eyes, his touch lingered in her mind. The streets outside her window were still, and the wind howled against the glass. She pulled the blankets up tighter and tried to forget about it, but her mind wouldn't let go. And somewhere, in the darkness just beyond her window, she could almost hear the faint rumble of a bus engine. It wasn't just the bus that was gone, it was the man, and he wasn't finished with her yet. Story 2. The man at the hotel lobby. Jacob hadn't planned on staying in a hotel that night, but sometimes life doesn't work out the way you expect. It was late, and his eyes felt heavy from hours on the road. The highway stretched out before him, empty, a long ribbon of asphalt leading nowhere in particular. He hadn't passed a gas station in miles, and the only sign of civilization was a faded billboard that read, "Rest here. Safe and quiet hotel ahead." Jacob had seen better signage, but the light from the billboard looked like salvation. He turned off the road and followed the winding path until he came upon the hotel. It was small, old, with crumbling bricks and a crooked sign hanging by a thread. The windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years, their edges thick with grime. It was tucked away in a corner of nowhere, a place forgotten by time. Jacob hesitated for a moment, but his exhaustion won over, and he pulled into the lot. He parked his car and stepped out, stretching his aching limbs. The air was thick with an eerie quietness, as though the world itself had gone still. The sound of his footsteps echoed as he crossed the gravel lot and made his way to the front door. The door creaked open, and he stepped into the lobby. The interior of the hotel was even more run down than the outside. A dull, yellowish light flickered from a dusty chandelier above, casting strange shadows across the room. The carpet was threadbare, the wallpaper peeling in long strips. A faint smell of mildew hung in the air. At the front desk, a man stood, his back to Jacob. He was wearing a wrinkled white shirt and a pair of old slacks. As Jacob walked up to the counter, the man turned around with a slight smile that sent a chill crawling up Jacob's spine. "Welcome," the man said, his voice deep and smooth, almost as if he were reading from a script. "You're the only guest tonight, sir." Jacob paused for a moment. The man's voice seemed oddly familiar, but he couldn't place it. There was something about the way the man looked at him, though, that felt off. His eyes were too wide, his smile too perfect, as if it were glued on. And the way he spoke, it wasn't just a greeting. It was like he already knew Jacob was coming. "I'll just need to sign in," Jacob muttered, trying to shake off the unease gnawing at him. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at Jacob for a moment too long, as though sizing him up. Finally, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a register. "Room 12, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "It's the only one available." Jacob signed the guest book, then handed the man his credit card. The man looked at it with a strange, almost bored expression, then handed it back without a word. Jacob felt something brush against his hand when the man passed it back, like a slight, icy touch. He pulled his hand back quickly, his heart suddenly racing. "Thank you," Jacob said, his voice shaky despite himself. The man didn't respond. He just nodded, his eyes never leaving Jacob. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, almost as if it were a secret. "But I suppose it doesn't matter anymore." Jacob froze, his blood running cold. He stared at the man, unsure of how to respond. What did he mean by that? Before he could ask, the man gave him that same unnerving smile and pointed to the hallway. "The room's just down the hall. It's a quiet place. Best sleep you'll ever have." Jacob didn't want to stay, but there was no other choice. He needed rest, and there was nowhere else to go. He grabbed his bag and quickly made his way to the hall. The man's words echoed in his mind. "You're not supposed to be here." He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but he shrugged it off. It was just a strange hotel, nothing more. The hallway was dim, the only light coming from the flickering bulbs overhead. The doors to the rooms were old, faded, and chipped. As Jacob approached room 12, he noticed something odd. There were no other doors along the hall. It was as though the hotel had simply stopped at this one room, as if it had been frozen in time. He opened the door and stepped inside. The room was cold, and the air smelled stale, like it had been locked up for years. The bed was made, but it looked old and worn. The carpet was the same faded brown as the hallway. There was nothing particularly comforting about it, but Jacob didn't care. He needed sleep. He tossed his bag onto the bed and closed the door behind him. As he undressed, he heard the faint sound of something scraping against the walls, like nails against chalkboard. It was soft at first, but then it grew louder, closer. His heart began to pound. He stopped what he was doing and stood still, listening. The sound was coming from outside his door. Scraping, rasping, and then a soft thud. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. He crept over to the door and peered through the peephole. At first, he saw nothing but the empty hallway. But then, just as he was about to step away, he saw something move. A shadow, tall and thin, standing just outside his door. He backed away from the door, his hands trembling. The shadow was gone, but the sound continued. It was as though someone or something was dragging itself along the hallway, slowly, deliberately, closer and closer. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Jacob could hear his own breathing now, ragged and shallow. He waited, frozen, as time stretched out in that room like a rubber band ready to snap. Finally, after what felt like hours, the noise stopped altogether. The silence was so complete it was suffocating. Jacob waited for a moment, then slowly, cautiously, opened the door. The hallway was empty. He stepped out into the dim light, his footsteps echoing as he moved to the lobby. The man was nowhere to be found. The lobby was silent. The front desk was empty. The hotel felt like a ghost town. Jacob's stomach twisted in knots. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He went to the receptionist's desk and rang the bell, but no one came. He rang it again and again until he heard footsteps coming from the back. The woman who appeared seemed startled to see him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but tight. I need to check out," Jacob said, his voice unsteady. The woman looked at him curiously, then reached for the guest register. Her fingers paused as she read his name. "I'm afraid the hotel's been closed for years," she said, her eyes widening slightly. "There's no one here. Not anymore. It's abandoned." Jacob stared at her, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" "I just checked in. I spoke to a man. He gave me a room." The woman blinked at him. "There hasn't been anyone here for months, maybe more. No guests, no staff. This place was closed down after a guest disappeared under strange circumstances." She paused, as though trying to decide whether or not to say more. "There's no man in the lobby. No one has been here for a long time." Jacob's blood ran cold. He had spoken to that man. He had seen him. The woman's face softened, and she took a step back. "Are you sure you're all right, sir?" Jacob didn't answer. He was already out the door, into the cold, empty night. As he looked back, the hotel seemed to fade into the shadows, as if it were never there at all. And the man? No one had seen him before. Story 3. The Unexpected Help. Maggie had always been the kind of person who liked to take the long way home. She didn't mind the solitude. There was something calming about it, especially when the world was winding down and the stars began to take their places in the vast sky. It was on one of these peaceful nights, however, that she found herself stranded on a desolate highway, her car coughing and sputtering to a halt for the third time in a row. The engine gave one final groan and died completely. She leaned her head back against the headrest, her breath steady, but her heart was starting to race. The only thing she could see was the black ribbon of asphalt stretching out in both directions. No streetlights, no signs of civilization. She checked her phone. Nothing. No signal. Nothing to help but the silence of the night, thick and suffocating. Maggie had heard the horror stories of people getting stranded on lonely roads like this, but she didn't let fear take hold. She wasn't one to panic. She could handle this. It wasn't like there was a storm coming, and the night air was cool, not freezing. She opened the door and stepped out, her boots crunching against the gravel beneath her feet. The lights of her car barely illuminated the stretch of road in front of her, and the trees on either side loomed like dark, silent sentinels. She paced for a while, trying to keep herself busy, but the night felt like it was stretching on forever. Her watch showed it was well past midnight. As the minutes turned into hours, Maggie found herself becoming more restless. Her eyes kept scanning the road, hoping for a car to pass by, but the highway was eerily empty. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, and the sound felt almost too loud in the stillness. The occasional car might speed by, but they were just distant headlights that barely reached her in time to see anything. They never slowed. She cursed under her breath. She hadn't expected this. Who expects to be stuck on a stretch of road like this, alone, in the middle of nowhere? But then, just when she was about to give up on the world entirely, she heard it, a car engine in the distance. The rumble of tires on asphalt growing louder. Maggie's heart leaped. This was it. This was her chance. Her car wasn't going to fix itself, and there was no way she could walk to the nearest town. She stepped out onto the shoulder, waving her arms to get the attention of whoever was coming. The car drew closer, and she was able to make out the shape of an old sedan, headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The car slowed as it approached her, and for a moment, Maggie's pulse quickened. She wasn't used to accepting help from strangers, especially in the middle of nowhere, but she had no choice. The sedan came to a stop beside her. The window rolled down, revealing a man who looked to be in his late 30s, dressed in a worn leather jacket, his hair slightly messy. His eyes were tired, but he smiled in a way that seemed reassuring, though there was something about it that didn't quite sit right. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly, like it hadn't been used much lately. Maggie hesitated for a moment. "My car broke down," she said, trying not to sound as desperate as she felt. "I can't get it started." The man nodded, his smile widening a little. "I could take a look for you. Been driving these roads for years. I know them pretty well." She glanced at her car, then back at the man. There was something strange about the way he looked at her, like he knew more than he should, but it was better than sitting alone in the dark, waiting for someone who might never come. "Okay," Maggie said reluctantly. "I'd appreciate the help." He climbed out of the car, and Maggie took a step back as he walked around to the front of her car. His movements were oddly deliberate, as though every step had been rehearsed. Maggie stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do. She could feel his eyes on her, but when she looked up, he was already crouching beneath the hood of her car, fiddling with the engine. At first, there was nothing remarkable about him, except for how quiet he was. He didn't ask her any questions about where she was headed or how long she'd been stuck there. Instead, he started talking, softly at first, then more persistently. "You ever feel like you're being followed?" he asked, as if it was the most normal question in the world. Maggie frowned, taken aback by the sudden change in tone. What? You know, he continued, not looking up from the engine, like someone's behind you. But when you turn around, there's no one there. I've been feeling that way for years, ever since I started traveling this road. Funny thing is, I know I'm not alone out here. The hairs on the back of Maggie's neck stood up. There was something unsettling in his words, a kind of heaviness to them. She didn't want to say anything that might encourage him to continue down this strange path, so she just nodded awkwardly. Yeah, sometimes I feel like that, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The man paused for a moment, then straightened up, his face still unreadable. You know, he said, I've been driving for a long time now. Alone. No family. No one to call. You ever wonder what it's like? Just disappearing? Like, one day, you're here, and the next you're gone. Maggie's stomach dropped. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, she saw something in them, a flicker of something dark, something dangerous. It wasn't just loneliness she saw. It was a kind of emptiness that made her blood run cold. Maggie started, but the words didn't come. She swallowed hard, then turned her gaze back to the road, trying to ignore the unease creeping up her spine. Before she could say anything else, she heard the sound of a car engine in the distance. Maggie glanced down the road, relieved to see headlights approaching. She turned back to the man, about to thank him and get into her car, but the moment she did, he stood up quickly. That's my ride, he said curtly. I gotta go. Maggie stood frozen, watching as he walked briskly back to his sedan without another word. The car's engine roared to life, and before she could even blink, the man was gone, swallowed by the night. She didn't even have time to process what had just happened before another car pulled up beside her, this one from a local tow truck service. She gave a quick, relieved wave to the driver, who stopped to help her. After the car was towed and she finally made it home, her mind raced. Later that week, feeling unsettled by the encounter, Maggie called the local authorities to report the strange man. She gave them a description, hoping to get some answers, but the response she received left her chilled to the bone. Ma'am, we're sorry to inform you, but the man you encountered is not alive, the officer on the phone told her. According to our records, a man matching that description was killed in a car crash on that same highway 5 years ago. We've had multiple reports from other people about seeing him, but he's been dead for years. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. The man she had met, the one who had offered help and vanished into the night, was a ghost, or something else entirely. The thought made her skin crawl. Now, every time she drives that highway, she wonders, was the man real? Or was he something darker, something that could never truly leave the road behind?